Today, what I wanted to talk about was some of the projects that I have been involved with in climate change. So a lot of this work came out when I was in at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and it was a group of us, and it was myself, and it was about 5 or 6 of my students. Together, we called ourselves the Urban Environmental Studies Research Coven. So it was all of us, and what we really did was to really think about urban education from an interdisciplinary standpoint, and what we were most interested in is looking at theories from geography, sociocultural theory, and critical theory approaches to thinking about the relationships of people between the urban environment in the context of teaching and learning. Because at the time, well, still do, there was a lot of deficit perspective or negative attitudes about people who lived in cities, people who were underrepresented. So in New York City, that means Black people, that means Latino people, that means people who are immigrants. And so there was always this negative attitude, or what we call deficit perspectives. And so we wanted to study and to shift that. So our approach in general was thinking both about the students and about the teachers. So how do we give first teachers, how do we empower them to teach about urban environment and climate in different ways, and in that way they would be empowering their students. So going beyond like the usual ways of teaching about climate and environment, but in ways that center their experiences, their identities, and their own perspectives as youth living in New York City and in other areas, because I'm going to be talking about 2 different areas today. So some of the definitions, some definitional stuff in the beginning. So when we think about resilience, we think about it, the ability of a social and environmental system to respond and to recover from any kind of disasters or anything that happens. And a way that we, say it colloquially is just to bounce back. And there was always this notion of bouncing back and going back to normal. But now we know, because we're not only globally experiencing climate change, but we've gone through a global pandemic, and we know that there really isn't a bouncing back to something that's normal, but it's rather adapting and transforming to live with a new normal. And because things are happening so fast now, and things are changing, it is going to be more of a constant adaptation rather than thinking about, what is normal and what is normal, because there really isn't going to be a new stable normal, but a constant adapting and changing. So a recent thing in going down the rabbit hole preparing for this talk, came across this notion of a polycrisis. And I thought that this definitely explains a lot of the things that we deal with and that we confront in today's world. When we think about a polycrisis, it's the simultaneous, interconnected collapse or stress of multiple economic systems. So global environment, political, education, so a lot of different systems together. Again, we saw that with COVID, that it was just not only healthcare that was involved, but our world shut down, so there was the economics. And then we can see with the economics, like we were talking about the shops, a lot of the shops and things that we would normally frequent before COVID, they no longer exist. A lot of us at work, we have to adapt to living in a hybrid type of work environment now, whereas before, almost all of our meetings were face-to-face. We walked around and we met people. Now we have these hybrid meetings, and sometimes you have, I know in my experience, you have one after another. So how do we adapt to these different systems? And when we think about climate, it's kind of the same thing. Because once, when the climate changes, like in New York City, there is a lot more flooding now. That means that the subway system shut down. That means people cannot get to work. So there's those economic implications of that. The water can be dirty, so people can get sick from that. So there's a lot of different systems that come together, and it's not just one. And so when we think that we have to navigate these crises, it requires some type of adaptability. It requires us to develop more strong community-based networks rather than relying on like the top down from the government. But how are we going to be helping our neighbors? How are we relating to our neighbors? What kinds of systems are we developing in order to make sure that our families and those that are close to us are able to adapt and able to, to move forward and flourish in this constantly changing environment and systems. And so in this notion of polycrisis, and I actually watched a video, I think and that's where I, learned about this. And what this professor, what he was saying is that when we think about polycrisis, and he studies polycrises or, like from historical up until now, like looking at the past in order to think about ways to adapt and change to the future, is that this is not new. A lot of this is not new. We've always dealt with wars, economic turmoil, xenophobia, famine, droughts, Black Plague. We talked about the Black Plague. Climate has always fluctuated and changed over time. So causally entangled systems across regions. So he described it as being more regionally and more contained. But what is new is that we are in a very interconnected world, and we see that, and it's not only in our media, because something that is trendy here can be trendy all over the world by just a click of a couple of buttons. But people travel more frequently now. People just travel a lot more now, and a lot of us have family in different places, so we're more interconnected. The global scale, and we can think about climate. Everyone is experiencing it somehow, whether you are in a remote village in a mountain or you are living in a big city. Some people are experiencing it more in more big ways, and some people are experiencing it in small ways, but we are all experiencing it. And so the global scale, and then as far as climate, we are now at a point, unfortunately, where a lot of the changes are permanent and they're not going to go back to where they were before. So what we have to do is figure out how are we going to adapt, and in any ways that possible, how are we going to prevent more changes from occurring? So those are the differences of where we are now. And then just going back to like some of the environmental education stuff. So back when we were doing the environmental education, we always thought about it in notions, or like I say, the system thought about it, like there's environmental damage. So like we're dealing with climate crisis right now. So there would be some kind of green curriculum, so because we're in this climate crisis, everybody needs to reduce their carbon footprint. So what does that mean? It means recycling. It means you walk more. It means you do, bike more. You get an electric car. So those are described as pro-environmental behaviors. But we know that like these individualistic approaches, and this approach of looking from damage to these little solutions, these do not work in the polycrisis that we experience. But rather, we have to think about what are things that we can do more as a collective, as a community that is going to help us and help each other to learn and adapt to these different types of crises. So one of the ways that we were thinking about it in that group, and just more in this reiterative way, like how are we going to do some interconnected science and environmental learning, that's going in a ways that are going to give communities and learners agencies that will renew different types of relationships with the environment, imagining new types, and just kind of keep on going in this type of cycle so that we are shifting, reimagining, having agency in the actions that we're doing learning from those actions, and so that we are in this mode of adapting and changing rather in a mode of just being still and just trying to keep doing things as is when things have changed or things are changing. So the projects that I'm going to be talking about, even though they're very different contexts, but they all share the same things that produce the polycrisis that we're experiencing. And I'm talking about the global climate change. And so geographical, one context is a small island nation in the Caribbean. The other one is a coastal, large global city, one of the largest cities in the world. Okay, economic, again, going back to the professor that I did some research on, there's the growing inequality. That's a key driver in the polycrisis. So as the rift between the rich and the poor grows, that contributes to people not being able to adapt effectively to polycrisis. So limited access to resources. Some people get to hoarding resources, whereas others don't have access to resources. And so political, people that have limited access to political powers, populations that have been historically marginalized, so whether that is race, whether that is gender, whether that is language, whether that is some type of indigenous status, so those populations that have been historically marginalized. So what we have to think about is especially those, the ones that have been the most oppressed. How can we leverage the knowledge and resources that they have and they hold in order to mitigate climate risk? Because when you start to work and think about those who are the most marginalized and things that will help the most marginalized, ultimately that's going to help all of society. So we, in our research group, we thought about it from this perspective. Okay, so the first context is an artist residency in a human ecodynamics field school on the island of Barbuda. And Barbuda is a small island in the Eastern Caribbean. And the thing that makes this island vulnerable is that it's a low-lying and it's a relatively flat island. A lot of the islands in the Caribbean, and I probably should have had a map, I'm sorry for not having that. A lot of the islands in the Caribbean are very mountainous. You know, even though there's a lot of beach, people know the Caribbean for beaches and sun, but there's a lot of mountains. This island is unique in that it's a flat island, and that it's also a dry island, and it's a limestone island. And for the island of Barbuda, there was an indigenous population called the Saladoids, and then enslaved Africans were brought over. But by the time the enslaved Africans came, the Saladoids left the island. And then now, so a lot of the descendants are descendants of the enslaved Africans that were on the island. And this is the research school. It's a small, building, but it was built there for doing archaeological research. But because it was a human ecodynamics school, she brought in, other archaeologists, sociologists, anthropologists, educators like myself, scientists that were studying marine biology, ecology. So a lot of different people came in and did different types of interdisciplinary work with this field school. So this is just some pictures of Barbuda. So it had different ecosystems or different microenvironments, but they were all, the thing that they had in common is that these were all adapted to living in a very hot and dry, low-lying place. So you can see this is limestone. This is the limestone road there. They're known for these frigate birds. Those frigate birds, they have the largest frigate bird population in that area of the world. And these birds come from all over, and this is where they come and they mate and they have their young, and then they go out to sea. They'll spend months out to sea, and most of that time that they spend out in the sea, they're flying. So And so because of this is a very important ecosystem for these birds, because there's thousands of them that come here. But then also they deal with environmental conditions like this. It's hard to get things on the island once they get there, and then it's hard to get things off of the island. There's like a ferry once a day. It's a 3-hour ride on this ferry boat, so it's very hard. So that's another thing that they have to deal with. If that ferry is broken, that means that they don't have water and they don't have supplies like gasoline and things that they get from Antigua, which is the bigger island next door, or other islands. If there is a hurricane or if there is some kind of storm, they can get no supplies for weeks and for even months. And so that's one of the challenges with living on them. So again, these don't, and you can see by the cars that people use as much as they could from the cars, and they recycle as much as they can, but there's only but so much you can do. There is no metal plant on the island that's going to help and melt this down and turn this into something else. So there is a lot of waste that's on the island in certain concentrated areas. So this is at the Barbuda Field School. So one of the things that Dr. Curtis Harris and the rest of us that came there and done is, again, thinking about this notion of climate change and also thinking about the history of people on the island. How do we move forward and adapt in a changing climate? And so historically, that island, Barbuda, was considered the bread basket of Antigua. So the enslaved people on Barbuda grew a lot of plants and vegetables and things for the plantations on Antigua. After enslavement, they grew a lot of stuff for the hotels and the tourist industry that was on Antigua. But once the hotels and the tourist industries, they started to import fruits from these big conglomerates, these big corporations, they no longer needed the fruits that were produced on Barbuda. So they have to be thinking about what is another way of generating income while also being self-sufficient. So one of the work with the Human Ecodynamic Center is to work alongside the Barbudans in order to figure out what are some ways and what are some things that they can do. So this is the beginning of what's called an aquaponics pond, where they are growing fish in order for, to feed the population. Because Caribbean people, we love fish. I'm Caribbean, I'm Jamaican, by ancestry, but we love fish. But the issue with the fish is that people want fish from the sea. They don't like freshwater fish. So there had to be a whole process of how do you get people to eat a kind of fish that they're not used to. So there was a lot of community-based efforts around that, just because, again, given climate change and ocean seawater rising, a lot of the natural fisheries around the island don't produce as much fish as they did. And that was also a source of income for the fishermen. So they're trying to figure out how to do this as another source of income. So with the art and science, what we did is that we had an engaged artist residency. So an artist came down and spent time with the Barbudan children in order to brainstorm creatively what are some of those things that made their identity strong as Barbudans? What are those things that they were proud of as Barbudans? And then how can they help and adapt in this changing climate? So they really didn't have as many art programs down there. Again, it's a small island, so having this kind of enrichment opportunity was good for the students to think about and to brainstorm about different climate actions in different ways. And so in this way, we were framing it as art allowing new ways of thinking about it, art as placemaking. So really thinking about how can help them to identify with both their identities and also in their what the solutions could be, and imagination. And so this is just some background information about it. The first artist that engaged with that, he was also an ecologist and an environmental artist, and really loved the work of Tim Ingold. So that's what that was one of the quotes that he used a lot. To correspond with the world, in short, is not to describe it or to represent it, but to answer it. So he viewed art and framed it in this project as a way of answering the world. So the world is telling us that, yes, I'm changing, I'm getting heating, and things are not going to be the same. So how do we answer it? And so we saw this connection of art and science as a way of existing in and understanding the world, and it provided a good space for young people to develop habits of creative correspondence and responsiveness to a rapidly changing world. So this is the artist residency. So what the artists would do is that the artists would teach art classes to students. Then they would engage them in creating some type of collaborative art while they're also doing their own personal body of work. Okay, so here he is with the students, or not him, he's not in this picture, or I remember he's not in any of the pictures actually. So what he did first was he showed students some of the ideas, some of his artwork. And so he showed these to the students and did different types of exercises with them about looking and seeing and describing the art. And then giving them like things where they would go out and they would observe their world, and then they would come back and do different activities. So he spent a lot of time teaching them how to look, and then to represent beyond what they were just seeing with their eyes, but using colors to think, well, how do you feel about that? And what colors would describe how you feel about that? So that's some more of the pictures of the students. So this is some of them. So you can see here with the frigate birds, those are very important to the students, and they recognize that. The mountains are there because that is a part of the larger island that there is 3 hours away from them by ferry. And then this tree was very important to them because this is one of the largest and oldest trees on the island. And this is where they would go and they would sit and gather and do a lot of their observing and then their creation of the art. And so here's some more with the students under the tree. So again, like looking and observing. Looking, observing, and under the tree. And then this was when they started to brainstorm around the mural that they ultimately collectively created. So what are some of those things that are important to them as Barbudans? What do they identify with? And so a lot of the things that you see on there's a fishing creek, the horse track, that's a big deal there. Cocoa Point, Castle Hill, those are the names of some of the important places to them. The beaches, there was a little museum that was on the land of the Ecodynamics Field School, the wharf. And so they brainstormed all of these different things that made their island unique and that they identified with as Barbudans. And what they did with this is that they created this mural. So again, you see the frigate birds, very important to them. The ferry boat, very important to them again, because that's their way on and off the island, and that's the way that they get supplies for the island. And yes, the mountain is represented, but then I also remember that there is some green spaces that are slightly elevated, but not quite mountainous, but they still wanted those green spaces represented. And then around the areas, around the blue around, they wanted somehow like the sea animals represented. And so they just decided to put those around the periphery of the paint rather than painting them right there. And then the little red boat is a fishing boat because again, that is an important source of food and money for the islanders, and decorating it with conch shells and everything like that. And so these are some of the things that the kids say, because a lot of times kids, one of the main things they were concerned about in creating art was, it's not going to look good, I'm going to make a mistake and then I can't fix it. And then this is what one of the kids said, that he always said, every mistake turns out to be a treasure, so they kept that with them. And on creativity and being creative, there's no right or wrong way in art. I learned that you don't have to make it perfect to work. In art, I learned how to interpret things better, how to imagine things when they are not there. So with the art, they were pushed beyond their comfort zone and enabled them to realize that they could make something and they could make it good. And so not to be hard on themselves and being able to trust them, and then doing something outside of their norm. So these are the different types of dispositions that allow students to think creatively in other contexts, so they're moving beyond what is normal and gaining that empowerment just through this art making process. And then the other thing that they wanted to make that to really respond, in a direct response to climate change. So with the sea will rise and Barbuda will survive. And this also came from the notion that Barbuda has survived for hundreds of years. And there have been different types of disasters before. And they said, so this was their way of saying that, yes, we will face different hurricanes and things like that, but we will survive. And sure enough, this Hurricane Irma came, which was one of the biggest hurricanes to hit. And it was devastation. Thinking about a poly crisis, there were also political issues around that because the prime minister made everyone leave the island. They were all required to leave the island. And there was some subversive things that happened. So right now, there is a lot of activism now around Barbuda retaining sovereignty of this island, because this island with very, very pretty beaches. And so the prime minister was seeing money and resorts and things like that. But Barbudans are no, this is our island, these are our beaches, and we get to use them however we want. So there is this ongoing issues right now. A lot of those kids that were in the project then are now young adults and pretty much on the front line along with their elders advocating, for this land. Because another thing that I should have mentioned before is that this land was quote unquote owned by the enslaver named Codrington. And when there was emancipation, he left the island to the enslaved people there. And so they all own that island, but there has been a constant battle between them and the main island, Antigua, about that notion of ownership of land. So that whole fight continues because they're we are the indigenous people of this land. This is our land. And it can't, because technically that land cannot be bought and sold. If you are a Barbudan and you are of age and you want a piece of land, you just basically go out and find your land and then you put some bottles on it and then you claim it and eventually you build. But again, because of the ship and 3 hours and everything, it may take you a couple of decades just to build one house because you don't get all of the supplies all at once. Okay, so when I think about the science and art connection, thinking about the Barbuda Research Complex and the addition of this artist residency. Okay, so this is just about the similar approaches that artists and scientists do, because we like to separate science and art, but they're really, when you think about it, two sides of the same coin, because these are both groups of people that are keenly observing and that their universe and their world, but documenting it in different ways. I know that there are a lot of scientists who are also artists, and then there's a lot of artists who also have a very keen interest in science. I have a friend who is a spoken word artist, and he's always no, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a scientist. I'm in many ways you are, because you observe the world and you do it in a systematic way, and then you document it in your spoken word. So the next one is just quickly about New York City, the project that we did in New York City. And when a lot of people, even though people go there and they visit, how many people have been to New York City before? Okay, a few people have, but people associate the buildings and things like that. But New York City is a coastal city. So this project is about climate resilience in an urban context. So while it's a very different geographical context from Barbuda, there's still a lot of the same things that they deal with, because a lot of these kids are from lower income families, And this is like the storm. This project came after the storm that happened in 2012. There was widespread flooding, so you can see all of the flood in the areas that were flooded. And a lot of the schools, and I'll show you a map before, they were in these areas that were flooded in the dark areas. Actually, the insurance flood maps had to change because of this storm. Lower Manhattan, they were in darkness for, I think it was about a week or something like that, but it was a pretty devastating storm. So schools across the city closed for a week. 200 of the school's buildings were damaged, and 24 schools had to be completely shut down and located. So that's an auditorium in one of the schools, and you can kind of see that it's pretty much flooded with water. And so this project, the Resilient Schools Consortium, and there's a whole website about this because they received funding from different sources to do that. It was an in-school, after-school program, and it was aimed around giving the kids opportunity to develop agency in climate change, resiliency, and vulnerability. So it was designed for a teacher or an educator learning program, and that program was both for the in-class and an after-school, because some schools did it as an in-class project, and some of the schools did it as an after-school project. And so these are where the schools are located. So you can see if you go back to that flood map, most of them are located where the schools were flooded. And the one that's kind of in the middle, that was one of the relocated schools. And so the general approach, first learning about risk and climate change to coastal cities. They did a school building audit and assessment for different types of vulnerabilities. And so as they were looking around, they looked and they saw, boilers that were damaged. They saw auditoriums. They saw gyms. They also saw spaces that they felt could be expanded as a safe place for the community if they were to face this again, because it's inevitable that it's going to happen again. And then they brainstormed, designed, and then they presented their solutions to different community and elected officials. And each school received a small amount of money in order to do something towards what their big plans were. And so in all of this is thinking about how you respond to a poly crisis. So thinking about the long-term vision while responding to the immediate needs. So that's what the RISK program did, and that's what the Barbuda program did. So what were the immediate needs, and how are we going to see this in the long term? So preserve what matters and what has worked before. And so with the RISK school building, they saw that was one of the schools was used as a safe place. And then how can you make it safer, and how can you expand it so more people can access? It's not about those big transformations, but it's about those small, immediate changes that people can make. Don't be afraid of radical change. Thinking about prosperity over profits. In the Barbuda example, they were thinking first about how are we going to sustain people on the island before we can think about how we're going to sell and plant and sell things to sell to other places. And so think collectively. Local is very important. So thinking about what you can do in your building, what you can do in your local community, what you can do in your district. So thinking locally and then expanding it with those small changes. So maybe you're doing something over here in your community, somebody's doing something over there similar in their community. How can you make connections around that so that there is more impact? And then confront if there is going to be conflict. And I know that there's been talk lately about empathy being a weakness, and it's not. Empathy is actually a strength, being able to put yourself and to feel how someone else is feeling. So when you are engaged in conflict, how can you be compassionate, and how can you put yourself in someone else's place? And then thinking about that notion of cognitive flexibility. The mental ability to switch between thinking about different concepts, adapt to unexpected changes, and overcome habitual responses. This is where I feel that the arts is very important. The arts helps to foster that adaptation and being able to switch how you think about different concepts. And then teaching and learning, I'm not going to go through this, but my research group, a lot of the stuff that I've done and that helped to shape a lot of this was done with this whole trip-krans heuristic in mind. And I'll just like run through a lot of those. You know, we came up with 6 different tenets of the trip-trans heuristic to help thinking about those complex problems, which right now we can talk about those in terms of polycrisis and just running through historicized knowledge, what has worked before, and how can this help us today. So whether that historic is like that immediate history or whether it's the history of going back in the past. I had a wonderful trip at the museum where we learned a lot about the history of science and technology in Korea, and that could be a way of going back. How did people adapt? How did people adapt to different climates and issues that came about then, and what can we learn from that for today, for adapting for the future? Okay, challenge assumptions of neutrality and objective. We talked about this in AI. This can be thought about in many different ways. There is no neutral technology or adaptation. Something that's working for climate change or climate change education in Barbuda or in the United States may not work here. It's about up to you as an educator, look through it. What is good about this? What can work here? What and how can I change it to make it more adapted to my context? So there is no immediate neutral adaptation of anything. Any type of hegemonic notions of knowledge production, start to think about who has knowledge in the community and how can that knowledge be brought into bear when we're thinking about risk and climate. So not going in as the expert, like I know everything that's happening here and I'm the best one. No. How do you talk to people and how do you get to know from your oldest elder to the youngest person? How do you learn from them? Situate, place, and space. This is a global map of different indigenous lands. So thinking about the land, thinking about the historic land, like how did people relate to the land and how did people interact with the land? And then privilege process over product, and this is very important. Slow, engage things slow. Yes, we know we can feel overwhelmed because things are happening at us really fast, but if we try to do fast implementations, that's not going to change anything. But take the time to reflect with yourself, reflect with people, and to implement those small changes and then see how they work before making larger changes. Okay, participatory learning and research. And then I always say transform education to fit the learners and not trying to change the learners to fit education. Okay, thank you.